Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the tests of controls. Okay, so test of controls, or this is also known as compliance test. This is an audit procedure that is designed to evaluate the operating effectiveness of the internal control in preventing, detecting, and correcting material misstatements at the assertion level. So in particular, the test of controls are performed to obtain evidence about the effectiveness of, first, the design of the internal control, whether they are suitably designed or not. Second is its operation uh, throughout the period, okay, if it is working well, okay, according to what is the purpose why internal controls are established. So, test of controls are performed normally when, first, the auditor's assessment of risk of material misstatement at assertion level includes the expectation that controls are suitably designed and are operating effectively, meaning test of controls will be conducted if the internal controls are effective. So the auditor plans to test the operating effectiveness of controls to determine also the nature, timing, and extent of the substantive procedure. So again, if the internal control is effective, so lesser substantive procedures will be performed at interim dates. Okay, because in this case, the auditor will rely on the internal control in preventing, detecting, and correcting material misstatements. So, if however the auditor believes that the internal control is ineffective or weak, then the auditor assesses control risk as high or maximum level. So test of controls will no longer be necessary because again, internal controls are not reliable anymore. So test of controls also are performed when substantive procedures alone cannot provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence at the assertion level, meaning test of controls are needed to assist the auditor in gathering appropriate and sufficient audit evidences along with substantive procedures. So, test of controls are also performed when there may be instances that the auditor may find it impossible to design effective substantive procedures that uh, by themselves provide sufficient appropriate audit evidence. For example, when an entity conducts its business using IT and no documentation of transactions is produced, so here substantive procedures are considered to be less effective. So this will be aided, or the auditor will be aided in gathering audit evidences using tests of controls. Another is, in such cases, the auditor is required to perform relevant tests of controls related to IT or using the computer-assisted audit techniques. So, test of controls, this refers to the compliance procedures as mentioned earlier rather than substantive procedures. So, while tests of controls are performed to determine if the internal controls are effective, substantive procedures, on the other hand, are performed to obtain evidence as to the completeness, accuracy, and validity of information that is generated by such system or information system. So this is how the auditor will perform test of controls and substantive procedures in uh, an environment or entity which uses IT and with less audit trail. So there may be instances also where the auditor may design test of controls to be performed concurrently or along with substantive procedures on the same transaction. So this is known as the dual purpose test. So for instance, inspecting documents may show evidence of improper authorization of transaction. So that is for the test of control. And also to detect misstatements in recording in terms of the amounts. So recalculating or determining the measurement of such transaction if that is correct. So this is our substantive procedure. Okay, so the auditor performs this test of control and substantive procedure at the same transaction at the same time. Okay, so although obtaining an understanding of the design and implementation of control is different from testing the operating effectiveness of the internal control, so the auditor may decide to perform them concurrently to promote audit efficiency. So this is how the auditor will efficiently perform the audit procedures. Okay, understanding of the controls as well as testing its effectiveness or operating effectiveness at the same time. Okay, so in this video lecture, we will continue with the nature of the tests of controls. So, test of controls, usually they include the following procedures. First, inquiries of the client personnel. Okay, so this is to determine if the implementation and the design is operating effectively. Another is inspection of documents and reports that is generated. So this will determine if the internal controls are able to detect, prevent, and correct misstatements. Another type of test of control is observation of the employees while they perform the policy or the procedure. Okay, another is reperformance of the policies to determine if this is consistent. Okay, that was performed previously by the client. Another is walkthrough test. So meaning the auditor will perform together with the employee of the entity such a procedure, okay, to determine if they indeed follow the guidelines. So inquiries and observation are usually performed on controls which has no audit trail. So audit trail meaning there is documentation, recording, and the preparation of financial statements where the auditor can follow the process of the preparation of the FS from the occurrence of the transaction. Okay, so that is what we mean by audit trail. Okay, so here, an audit trail is a chain of evidence provided through coding, cross-referencing, and documentation that connects the account balances and other summary results with the original transactions as well as calculations. Or in other words, these are the the source documents, the recording, up to the preparation of the financial statement of a certain transaction. Okay, so you can follow through that to determine if that is performed in accordance with their internal control and with the standard. Okay, so when evaluating the when evaluating the operating effectiveness of internal controls, the auditor will consider the following. First, how the controls were applied at relevant times during the period. Okay, another is the consistency. Okay, which the controls were applied. Another is by whom or by what means controls were applied. So this is the areas or the factors in which the auditor can use in evaluating the operating effectiveness of the internal control. Okay, so we will continue with the timing of test of controls. So the auditor will perform test of controls for the particular time or throughout the period. So for which the auditor intends to rely on those controls. So again, this design timing will depend on the risk assessment. So test of controls are usually performed at an interim date if the internal controls are effective. However, the auditor can decide to perform additional tests of controls to gather further audit evidence during the remaining period. That will depend on the following factors. First, if the significance of the assessed risk of material misstatement at assertion level, okay, or the level of the uh, risk of material misstatement as well. Okay, so this will um, change the original plan on the test of controls. Another is the specific controls that were tested during the interim period and the significant changes to them since they were tested. If in this case, if there are changes that will be made. Okay, another is the degree to which the audit evidence about the operating effectiveness of controls was obtained. Okay, if in this case the auditor was not satisfied in the test of controls that was performed in the interim date, so he will do further additional test of controls, okay, for the remaining period. Another is the length of time or the length of the remaining period. Okay, so if that is long enough, then the auditor may consider additional test of controls for the remaining period. Okay, another is the extent to which the auditor intends to reduce the substantive procedures based on the reliance on control. So this can only be made if, again, our internal control is effective. Okay, as well as the control environment, if that is strong. Okay, so if the auditor plans to use the audit evidence from a previous audit about the operating effectiveness of specific controls, so in this case, the auditor should establish the continuing relevance and reliability of that evidence. So he must obtain audit evidence about whether significant changes in those controls have occurred subsequent to the previous audit. Meaning, in this case, if the auditor was the previous auditor also, and based on his assessment in the previous audit, he found out that the internal controls are strong or effective, so he can rely on that also in the current period, provided he will establish the continuing relevance and reliability. So he will obtain again evidence. So it's like testing again the internal control if it's strong or weak. Okay, so the auditor should obtain this evidence by performing inquiry combined with observation, or he can do inspection to confirm the understanding of those specific controls if that is still effective at the current period. So, if there have been changes that affect the continuing relevance of the audit evidence from the previous audit, so the auditor should test the controls. So he will perform the test of controls for the current period. Okay, if there have been no changes, so or if there have not been such change or no changes, the auditor should test the controls at least once in every third audit. Okay, and should test some controls each audit to avoid the possibility of testing all the controls on which the auditor intends to rely in a single audit period. So with no testing of controls in the subsequent two periods, meaning in this case, he will do the testing once in every 3 audits, provided if he is still the auditor. Okay, and he will do the testing of the internal controls that is different from the past controls that he have tested, okay, to avoid testing all the controls which he intends to rely on the single audit. Okay, it's like getting sample of test of controls just to determine and obtain evidence about the reliability of the operating effectiveness of internal control. Okay, so when the auditor plans to rely on the controls over a risk, so the auditor has determined to be significant, then he should test those controls for the current period. So that is very important to avoid audit risk. Okay, so that is for the timing of test of control. So we will continue with the extent of the test of controls. Okay, so when more persuasive audit evidence is needed regarding the effectiveness of the internal control, so in this case, the auditor may increase the extent or the number of samples to be tested to determine if the internal controls are effective or not. So in determining the extent of the test of controls, so the following may be considered. First is the frequency of the performance of control by the entity using or during the period. So in this case, meaning that the auditor will determine if indeed the implementation of the internal controls are followed strictly by the entity. Okay, another is the length of time during the period that the auditor is relying on the effectiveness of the internal control. So here, he will determine that from the beginning as he do the audit until the end probably. Okay, so from time to time he will do the testing. Okay, so to determine if that is really or indeed effective. Another is the expected rate of deviation from the control. Okay, so here this is from the assessment as well as observation probably and checking of the documents, okay, to determine if the entity, its employees, and the management are really strictly following the guidelines and the policies. Okay, another is the relevance also and reliability of the audit evidence to be obtained about the operating effectiveness of the control, okay, at the assertion level. And also, the extent to which the audit evidence is obtained from test of controls are related to the assertion. Okay, so these are the different factors that needs to be considered by the auditor in determining the extent or the number of samples or how much, okay, he should do the test of controls. Okay, what about when there is deviation found while performing the test of controls? Okay, so in this case, when deviations from controls upon which the auditor intends to rely are detected, so the auditor here should make specific inquiries to further understand these matters. Okay, and also its potential consequences on the audit. So the auditor should determine whether, first, the test of controls that have been performed provide an appropriate basis for reliance. Okay, so this is also part of the assessment of the auditor. Okay, if the test of control is relevant, okay, the test of controls that he performed is relevant or appropriate basis if he will rely on those controls. Another is additional test of controls are necessary. Okay, so meaning in this case, the auditor should make sure really, okay, double check if that deviation is present also in other parts of the internal other parts, I mean, of the process or the procedure, or to determine if that deviation occurred only once and it's not recurring, so that he will be able to determine if he will rely on those controls or not. Another is the potential risk of misstatement that needs to be addressed using the substantive procedures. Okay, so if the auditor determines that the internal control is unreliable, so he will do more or additional substantive procedures. So in addition, the auditor should also evaluate whether, on the basis of the audit work performed, the auditor has identified a significant deficiency in the internal controls. So here, he will use his professional judgment to determine if that is, or if that deviation is significant, and he will communicate it with the proper authority. Okay, so those are for the tests of controls.